All right, there we go. Lord. Sorry, Streamlabs changed my mic settings. I don't know why, but we're back. All right, let's sit for another minute, maybe a minute and a half, and then we'll get started. I'm at that point in my 30s where it's like, oh, I can't move my neck. Is it because I slept on it weird? Is it because some dude cranked it in BJJ? Is it because I didn't stretch before rope? And the answer is probably that I slept on it weird. All right, I think it's a good time to get started. We left off partway through chapter 2. Some sort of airplane crashed after... what is the main character's name? Ray Baker? Something Baker. Hang on. Yeah, Ray Baker. And this woman slept together. Sorry, hang on. I'm trying to find the exact spot. It's different from a book, you know? I can't leave a bookmark in here. All right. I'm going to reread one of the lines we ended with, and we'll go from there. I'd thought from the first glimpse of it that the plane was disabled. I guess it was its silence that gave me the idea. This theory was confirmed when one of its very stubby wings or vanes touched a corner pillar of the cracking plant. The plane was moving in too slow a glide to be wrecked. In fact, it was moving in a slower glide than I would have believed possible, but then it's many years since I've seen a plane in flight. It wasn't wrecked, but the little collision spun it around twice in a lazy circle, and it landed on the freeway with a scuffing noise not 50 feet from us. You couldn't exactly say it had crashed in, but it stayed at an odd tilt. It looked crippled. It looked crippled all right. An oval door in the plane opened, and a man dropped lightly out on the concrete. And what a man! He was nearer 7 feet tall than 6, close-cropped blonde hair, face and hands richly tanned, the rest of him covered by trim garments of a gleaming gray. He must have weighed as much as the two of us together, but he was beautifully built, muscular, yet supple-seeming. His face looked brightly intelligent, and even-tempered, and kind. Yes, kind, damn him! It wasn't enough that his body should fairly glow with a health and vitality that was an insult to our seared skins and stringy muscles and ulcers and half-rotted stomachs and half-arrested cancers. He had to look kind, too. The sort of man who would put you to bed and take care of you, as if you were some sort of interesting sick fox, and maybe even say a little prayer for you, and all manner of other abominations. I don't think I could have endured my fury standing still. Fortunately, there was no need to. As if we'd rehearsed the whole thing for hours, the girl and I scrambled up onto the freeway and scurried toward the man from the plane, cunningly swinging away from each other so that it would be harder for him to watch the two of us at once, but not enough to make it obvious that we attended an attack from 2 quarters. We didn't run, though we covered the ground as fast as we dared. Running would have been too much of a giveaway too. And the pilot, which was how I named him to myself, had a strange-looking small gun in his right hand. In fact, the way we moved was part of our act. I dragged one leg as if it were crippled, and the girl faked another sort of limp, one that made her... Jeez, I'm sorry, my browser just minimized for no reason. So annoying. Okay. I dragged one leg as if it were crippled, and the girl faked another sort of limp, one that made her approach, a series of half-curtsies. Her arm in the sling was all twisted, but at the same time, she was accidentally showing her breasts. I remember thinking, "You won't distract this breed bull that way, sister. He probably has a harem of 6-foot heifers." I had my head thrown back, and my hands stretched out supplicatingly. Meanwhile, the both of us were babbling a blue streak. I was rapidly croaking something like, "Mister, for God's sake, save my pal. He's hurt a lot worse, and I'm not 100 yards away. He's dying, mister. He's dying. Oh, thirst, his tongue black and all swole up. Oh, save him, mister. Save my pal. He's not 100 yards away. He's dying, mister. Dying." And she was sing-songing an even worse rigmarole about they and how they were after us from Porter and going to crucify us because we believed in science, and how they'd already impaled her mother and her 10-year-old sister, and a lot more of the same. It didn't matter that our stories didn't fit or make sense. The babble had a convincing tone and was getting us closer to this guy, which was all that counted. He pointed his gun at me, and then I could see him hesitate, and I thought exultingly, "It's a lot of healthy meat you got there, mister. But it's tame meat, mister. Tame." He compromised by taking a step back and sort of hooting at us and waving us off with his left hand as if we were a couple of stray dogs. It was greatly to our advantage that we'd acted without hesitation, and I don't think we'd have been able to do that, except we'd been all set to kill each other when he dropped in. Our muscles and nerves and minds were keyed for instant, ruthless attack. And some civilized people still say that the urge to murder doesn't contribute to self-preservation. We were almost close enough now, and he was steeling himself to shoot. And I remember wondering for a split second what his damn gun did to you. And then me and the girl had started the alternation routine. I'd stop dead, as if completely cowed by the threat of his weapon, and as he took note of it, she'd go in a little further. And as his gaze shifted to her, she'd stop dead, and I'd go in another foot, and then try to make my halt even more convincing as his gaze darted back to me. We worked it perfectly. Our rhythm was beautiful, as if we were old dancing partners, though the whole thing was absolutely impromptu. Still, I honestly don't think we'd ever have got to him if it hadn't been for the distraction that came just then to help us. I could tell, you see, that he'd finally steeled himself, and we still weren't quite close enough. He wasn't as tame as I'd hoped. I reached behind me for Mother, determined to do a last-minute rush and leap anyway, when there came this sick scream. I don't know how else to describe it briefly. It was a scream, feminine for choice. It came from some distance and had the direction of the old cracking plant. It had a note of anguish and warning, yet at the same time it was weak and almost faltering, you might say, squeaky at the end, as if it came from a person half dead and a throat choked with phlegm. It had all those qualities, or a wonderful mimicking of them. And it had quite an effect on our boy in gray, for in the act of shooting me down, he started to turn and look over his shoulder. No, it didn't altogether stop him from shooting me. He got me partly covered again as I was in the middle of my lunge. I found out what his gun did to you. My right arm, which was the part he'd covered, just went dead, and I finished my lunge slamming up against his iron knees like a high school kid trying to block out a pro footballer with a knife slipping uselessly away from my fingers. But in the blessed meanwhile, the girl had lunged too, not with a slow slash, thank God, but with a high slicing thrust aimed arrow straight for a point just under his ear. She connected, and a fan of blood sprayed her full in the face. I grabbed my knife with my left hand as it fell, scrambled to my feet, and drove the knife at his throat in a roundhouse swing that happened to come handiest at the time. The point went through his flesh like nothing, and jarred against his spine with a violence that I hoped would shock into nervous insensibility the stoutest medulla oblongata and prevent any dying reprisals on his part. I got my wish, in large part. He swayed, straightened, dropped his gun, and fell flat on his back, giving his skull a murderous crack on the concrete for good measure. He lay there, and after a half-dozen gushes, the bright blood quit pumping strongly out of his neck. Then came the part that was like a dying reprisal, though obviously not being directed by him as of now, and, come to think of it, it may have had its good points. The girl, who was clearly a most cool-headed cuss, snatched for his gun where he'd dropped it to make sure she got it ahead of me. She snatched, yes, and then jerked back, letting off a sizable squeal of pain, anger, and surprise. Where we'd seen his gun hit the concrete, there was now a tiny, incandescent puddle. A rill of blood snaked out from the pool around his head and touched the whitely glowing puddle, and a jet of steam sizzled up. Somehow, the gun had managed to melt itself in the moment of its owner dying. Well, at any rate, that showed it hadn't contained any gunpowder or ordinary chemical explosives, though I already knew it operated on other principles from the way it had been used to paralyze me. More to the point, it showed that the gun's owner was the member of a culture that believed in taking very complete precautions against its gadgets falling into the hands of strangers. But the gun fusing wasn't quite all. As the girl and me shifted our gaze from the puddle, which was cooling fast and now glowed red like the blood, as we shifted our gaze back from the puddle to the dead man, we saw that at 3 points where you'd expect pockets to be, his gray clothing had charred in small, irregularly shaped patches from which threads of black smoke were twisting upward. Just at that moment, so close as to make me jump in spite of years of learning to absorb shocks stoically, right at my elbow, it seemed, the girl jumped too, I might say, a voice said, "Done a murder, hey?" Advancing briskly around the skewily grounded plain from the direction of the cracking plant was an old geezer, a seasoned, hard-baked Deathlander, if I ever saw one. He had a shock of bone-white hair. The rest of him that showed from his weathered gray clothing looked fried by the sun's rays, and others to a stringy crisp, and strapped to his boots and weighing down his belt were a good dozen knives. Not satisfied with the unnerving noise he'd made already, he went on brightly. "Neat job, too. I give you credit for that. But why the hell did you have to set the guy afire?" That's the end of chapter 2. Give me a moment to refresh myself. Okay. Chapter 3. We are always, thanks to our human nature, potential criminals. None of us stands outside humanity's black collective shadow. The Undiscovered Self by Carl Jung. Ordinarily, scroungers who hide around on the outskirts until the killing's done and then come in to share the loot get what they deserve, wordless orders well backed up to be on their way at once. Sometimes they even catch an afterclap of the murder urge if it hasn't all been expended on the first victim or victims. Yet they will do it, trusting, I suppose, to the irresistible glamour of their personalities. There were several reasons why we didn't at once give Pop this treatment. In the first place, we didn't either of us have distance weapons. My revolver and her dart gun were both tucked in the cave back at the edge of the freeway, and there's one bad thing about a bugger so knife-happy that he lugs them around by the carload, he's generally good at tossing them. With his dozen or so knives, Pop definitely outgunned us. Second, we were both of us without the use of an arm. That's right, the both of us. My right arm still dangled like a string of sausages, and I couldn't yet feel any signs of it coming undead. While she'd burned her fingers badly grabbing at the gun, I could see their red splotched tips now as she pulled them out of her mouth for a second to wipe the pilot's blood out of her eyes. All she had was her stump with the knife screwed to it. Me, I can throw a knife left-handed if I have to, but you bet I wasn't going to risk Mother that way. Then I'd no sooner heard Pop's voice, breathy and a little high like an old man's will get, than it occurred to me that he must have been the one who had given the funny scream that had distracted the pilot's attention and let us get to him. Which, incidentally, made Pop a quick thinker and imaginative to boot, and meant that he'd helped on the killing. Besides all that, Pop did not come in fawning and full of extravagant praise, as most scroungers will. He just assumed equality with us right from the start, and he talked in an absolutely matter-of-fact way, neither praising nor criticizing one bit. Too damn matter-of-fact and open, for that matter, to suit my taste. But then I have heard other buggers say that some old men are apt to get talkative, though I had never worked with or run into one myself. Old people are very rare in the Deathlands, as I'm sure you can imagine. So the girl and me just scowled at him but did nothing to stop him as he came along. Near us, his extra knives would be no advantage to him. He said. Looks a lot like a guy I murdered 5 years ago back down Los Alamos way. Same silver monkey suit, and almost as tall. Nice chap, too. Was trying to give me something for a fever I'd faked. That his gun melted? My man didn't smoke after I gave him his quietus, but then it turned out he didn't have any metal on him. I wonder if this chap... He started to kneel down by the body. Hands off, Pop! I gritted at him. That was how we started calling him Pop. Why, sure, he said, staying there on one knee. I won't lay a finger on him. It's just that I've heard the Alamosers have it rigged so that any metal they're carrying melts when they die, and I was wondering about this boy. But he's all yours, friend. By the way, what's your name, friend? Ray, I snarled. Ray Baker. I think the main reason I told him was that I didn't want him calling me friend again. You talk too much, Pop. I suppose I do, Ray, he agreed. What's your name, lady? The girl just sort of hissed at him, and he grinned at me as if to say, oh, women. Then he said, why don't you go through his pockets, Ray? I'm real curious. Shut up, I said. But I felt that he'd put me on the spot just the same. I was curious about the guy's pockets myself, of course, but I was also wondering if Pop was alone or if he had somebody with him, and whether there was anybody else in the plane or not. Things like that. Too many things. At the same time, I didn't want to let on to Pop how useless my right arm was. If I'd just get a twinge of feeling in that arm, I knew I'd feel a lot more confident fast. I knelt down across the body from him, started to lay Mother aside, and then hesitated. The girl gave me an encouraging look, as if to say, I'll take care of the old geezer. On the strength of her look, I put down Mother and started to pry open the pilot's left hand, which was clenched in a fist that looked a mite too big to have nothing inside it. The girl started to edge behind Pop, but he caught the movement right away and looked at her with a grin that was so knowing and yet so friendly and yet so pitying at the same time, with the pity of the old pro for even the seasoned amateur, that in her place I think I'd have blushed myself, as she did now, through the streaks of the pilot's blood. You don't have to worry about me none, lady, he said, running a hand through his white hair and incidentally touching the pommel of one of the two knives strapped on the back of his leather jacket so he could reach one over either shoulder. I quit murdering some years back. It got to be too much of a strain on my nerves. Oh yeah? I couldn't help saying as I pried up the pilot's index finger and started on the next. Then why the stab factory, Pop? "Oh, you mean those," he said, glancing down at his knives. "Well, the fact is, Ray, I carry them to impress buggers dumber than you and the lady here. Anybody wants to think I'm still a practicing murderer, I got no objections. Matter of sentiment, too. I just hate to part with them. They bring back important memories. And then, you won't believe this, Ray, but I'm going to tell you just the same. Guys just up and give me their knives, and I doubly hate to part with a gift." I wasn't going to say, "Oh yeah," again, or "shut up," either, though I certainly wished I could turn off Pop's spigot, or thought I did. Then, I felt a painful tingling shoot down my right arm. I smiled at Pop and said, "Any other reasons?" "Yep," he said. "Got to shave, and I might as well do it in style. A new blade every day in the fortnight is twice as good as the old ads. You know, it makes you keep a knife in fine shape if you shave with it. What you got there, Ray?" "You were wrong, Pop," I said. "He did have some metal on him that didn't melt." I held up for them to see the object I'd extracted from his left fist, a bright steel cube measuring about an inch across each side, but it felt lighter than if it were solid metal. 5 of the faces looked absolutely bare. The 6th had a round button recessed in it. From the way they looked at it, neither Pop nor the girl had the faintest idea of what it was. I certainly hadn't. "Had he pushed the button?" the girl asked. Her voice was throaty, but unexpectedly refined, as if she'd done no talking at all, not even to herself, since coming to the Deathlands, and so retained the cultured intonations that she'd had earlier, whenever and wherever that had been. It gave me a funny feeling, of course, because they were the first words I'd heard her speak. "Not from the way he was holding it," I told her. The button was pointed up toward his thumb, but the thumb was on the outside of his fingers. I felt an unexpected satisfaction at having expressed myself so clearly, and I told myself not to get childish. The girl slitted her eyes. "Don't you push it, Ray," she said. "Think I'm nuts?" I told her, meanwhile sliding the cube into the smaller pocket of my pants, where it fit tight and wouldn't turn sideways, and the button maybe get pressed by accident. The tingling in my right arm was almost unbearable now, but I was getting control over the muscles again. "Pushing that button," I added, "might melt what's left of the plane, or blow us all up. It never hurts to emphasize that you may have another weapon in your possession, even if it's just a suicide bomb." "There was a man pushed another button once," Pop said softly and reflectively. His gaze went far out over the Deathlands and took in a good half of the horizon, and he slowly shook his head. Then his face brightened. "Did you know, Ray," he said, "that I actually met that man, long afterwards? You don't believe me, I know, but I actually did. Tell you about it some other time?" I almost said, "Thanks, Pop, for sparing me, at least for a while," but I was afraid that would set him off again. Besides, it wouldn't have been quite true. I've heard other buggers tell the yarn of how they met and invariably rubbed out the actual guy who pushed the button or buttons that set the fusion missiles blasting toward their targets, but I felt a sudden curiosity as to what Pop's version of the yarn would be. Oh well, I could ask him some other time if we both lived that long. I started to check the pilot's pockets. My right hand could help a little now. "Those look like mean burns you got there, lady," I heard Pop tell the girl. He was right. There were blisters easy to see on 3 of the fingertips. "I've got some salve that's pretty good," he went on, "and some clean cloth. I could put a bandage on for you if you wanted. If your hand started to feel poisoned, you could always tell Ray there to slip a knife in me." Pop was a cute gasser, you had to admit. I reminded myself that it was Pop's business to play up to the both of us, charm being the secret weapon of all scroungers. The girl gave a harsh little laugh. "Very well," she said, "but we will use my salve. I know it works for me. And she started to lead Pop to where we'd hidden our things. I'll go with you, I told them, standing up. It didn't look like we were going to have any more murders today. Pop had got through the preliminary ingratiations pretty well, and the girl and me had had our catharsis, but that would be no excuse for any such stupidity as letting the two of them get near my 38. Strolling to the cave and back, I eased the situation a bit more by saying, "That scream you let off, Pop, really helped. I don't know what gave you the idea, but thanks." "Oh, that," he said. "Forget about it." "I won't," I told him. "You may say you've quit killing, but helped on a do-in today." "Ray," he said, a little solemnly, "if it'll make you feel any happier, I'll take a bit of the responsibility for every murder that's been done since the beginning of time." I looked at him for a while. Then, "Pop, you're not by any chance the religious type?" I asked suddenly. "Lord, no," he told us. That struck me as a satisfactory answer. God preserve me from the religious type. We have quite a few of those in the Deathlands. It generally means that they try to convert you to something before they kill you, or sometimes afterwards. We completed our errands. I felt a lot more secure with old financier's friend strapped to my middle. Mother is wonderful, but she is not enough. I dawdled over inspecting the pilot's pockets, partly to give my right hand time to come back all the way, and to tell the truth, I didn't much enjoy the job. A corpse, especially such a handsome cadaver as this, just didn't go with Pop's brand of light patter. Pardon me, I need to drink some more water. I'm starting to stumble a bit. Pop did up the girl's hand in high style, bandaging each finger separately, and then persuading her to put on a big left-hand work glove he took out of his small pack. "Lost the right," he explained, "which was the only one I ever used anyway. Never knew until now why I kept this. How does it feel, Alice?" I might have known he'd worm her name out of her. It occurred to me that Pop's idea of scrounging might extend to Alice's favors. The urge doesn't die out when you get old, they tell me. Not completely. He'd also helped her replace the knife on her stump with the hook. By that time, I'd poked into all the pilot's pockets I could get at without stripping him, and found nothing but 3 irregularly shaped blobs of metal still hot to the touch. Under the charred spots, of course. I didn't want the job of stripping him. Somebody else could do a little work, I told myself. I've been bothered by bodies before, as who hasn't, I suppose, but this one was really beginning to make me sick. Maybe I was cracking up, it occurred to me. Murder is a very wearying business, as all Deathlanders know, and although some crack earlier than others, all crack in the end. I must have been showing how I was feeling, because, "Cheer up, Ray," Pop said. "You and Alice have done a big murder. I'd say the subject was 6'10", so you ought to be happy. You've drawn a blank on his pockets, but there's still the plane." "Yeah, that's right," I said, brightening a little. "There's still the stuff in the plane." I knew there were some items I couldn't hope for, like 38 shells, but there'd be food and other things. "Nuh-uh," Pop corrected me. "I said the plane. You might have thought it's wrecked, but I don't. Have you taken a real gander at it? It's worth doing, believe me." I jumped up. My heart was suddenly pounding. I was glad of an excuse to get away from the body, but there was a lot more in my feelings than that. I was filled with an excitement to which I didn't want to give a name, because it would let the letdown become too great. One of the wide, stubby wings of the plane, raking downward so that its tip almost touched the concrete, had hidden the undercarriage of the fuselage from our view. Now coming around the wing, I saw that there was no undercarriage. I had to drop to my hands and knees and scan around with my cheek next to the concrete before I'd believe it. The wrecked plane was at all points at least 6 inches off the ground. I got to my feet again, I was shaking. I wanted to talk, but I couldn't. I grabbed the leading edge of the wing to stop from falling. The whole body of the plane gave a fraction of an inch and then resisted my leaning weight with lazy power, just like a gyroscope. Anti-gravity, I croaked, though you couldn't have heard me 2 feet. Then my voice came back. Pop, Alice, they've got anti-gravity. Anti-gravity, and it's working. Alice had just come around the wing and was facing me. She was shaking too, and her face was white like I knew mine was. Pop was politely standing off a little to one side, watching us curiously. Told you you'd want a real prize, he said in his matter-of-fact way. Alice wet her lips. Ray, she said, we can get away. Just those 4 words, but they did it. Something in me unlocked, no, exploded describes it better. We can go places, I almost shouted. Beyond the dust, she said. Mexico City, South America. She was forgetting the Deathlander's cynical article of belief that the dust never ends. But then, so was I. It makes a difference whether or not you've got a means of doing something. Rio, I topped her with. The Indies, Hong Kong, Bombay, Egypt, Bermuda, the French Riviera. Bullfights and clean beds, she burst out with. Restaurants, swimming pools, bathrooms. Skin diving, I took it up with, as hysterical as she was. Road races, roulette tables, Bentleys and Porsches, air coupes and DC-4s and Comets, martinis, hashish, ice cream sodas, hot food, fresh coffee, gambling, smoking, dancing, music, drinks. I was going to add women, but then I thought of how hard-bitten little Alice would look beside the dream creatures I had in mind. I tactfully suppressed the word, but I filed the idea away. I don't think either of us knew exactly what we were saying. Alice, in particular, I don't believe was old enough to have experienced almost any of the things the words referred to. There were mysterious symbols of long, interdicted delights spewing out of us. Ray, Alice said, hurrying to me, let's get aboard. Yes, I said eagerly, and then I saw a little problem. The door to the plane was a couple of feet above our heads. Whoever hoisted himself up first, or got hoisted up, as would have to be the case with Alice on account of her hand, would be momentarily at the other's mercy. I guess it occurred to Alice, too, because she stopped and looked at me. It was a little like the old teaser about the fox, the goose, and the corn. Maybe, too, we were both a little scared the plane would be booby-trapped. Pop solved the problem in the direct way I might have expected of him, by stepping quietly between us, giving a light leap, catching hold of the curving sill, chinning himself on it, and scrambling up into the plane so quickly that we'd hardly have time to do anything about it if we'd wanted to. Pop couldn't be much more than a bantamweight, even with all his knives. The plane sagged an inch, and then swung up again. As Pop disappeared from view, I backed off, reaching for my .38, but a moment later, he stuck out his head and grinned down at us, resting his elbows on the sill. Come on up, he said. It's quite a place. I promise not to push any buttons till you get here, though there's a whole regiment of them. I grinned back at Pop and gave Alice a boost up. She didn't like it, but she could see it had to be her next. She hooked onto the sill, and Pop got hold of her left wrist below the big glove and heaved. Then it was my turn. I didn't like it. I didn't like the idea of those two buggers poised above me while my hands were helpless on the sill, but I thought, Pop's a nut. You can trust a nut, at least a little ways, though you can't trust nobody else. I heaved myself up. It was strange to feel the plane giving and then bracing itself like something alive. It seemed to have no trouble accepting our combined weight, which, after all, was hardly more than half again the pilot's. Inside the cabin was pretty small, but, as Pop had implied, oh my, everything looked soft and smoothly curved, like you imagine your insides being, and almost everything was restfully dull silver. The general shape of it was something like the inside of an egg. Forward, which was the larger end, were a couple of screens and a wide viewport and some small dials, and the button brigades Pop had mentioned, lined up like blank typewriter keys, but enough for writing Chinese. Just aft of the instrument panel were two very comfortable-looking, strange, low seats. They seemed to be facing backwards, until I realized they were meant to be knelt into. The occupant, I could see, would sort of sprawl forward, his hands free for button pushing and such. There were spongy chin rests. Aft was a tiny instrument panel, and a kind of sideways seat, not nearly so fancy. The door by which we'd entered was to the side, a little aft. I didn't see any indications of cabinets or fixed storage spaces of any kind, but somehow stuck to the walls here and there were quite a few smooth, blobby packages, mostly dull silver too, some large, some small, valises and handbags, you might say. All in all, it was a lovely cabin, and more than that, it seemed lived in. It looked as if it had been shaped for, and maybe by, one man. It had a personality you could feel, a strong but warm personality of its own. Then I realized whose personality it was. I almost got sick. So close to it, I started telling myself it must be something anti-gravity did to your stomach. But it was all too interesting to let you get sick right away. Pop was poking into two of the large, mound-shaped cases that were sitting loose and open on the right-hand seat, as if ready for emergency use. One had a folded something with straps on it that was probably a parachute. The second had, I judged, 1,000 or more of the inch cubes, such as I'd pried out of the pilot's hand, all neatly stacked in a cubicle box inside the soft outer bag. You could see the 1 cube gap where he'd taken the one. I decided to take the rest of the bags off the walls and open them, if I could figure out how. The others had the same idea, but Alice had to take off her hook and put on her pliers before she could make progress. Pop helped her. There was room enough for us to do these things without crowding each other too closely. By the time Alice was set to go, I discovered the trick of getting the bags off. You couldn't pull them away from the wall no matter what force you used. At least I couldn't, and you couldn't even slide them straight along the walls. But if you gave them a gentle counterclockwise twist, they came off like nothing. Twisting them clockwise glued them back on. It was very strange, but I told myself that if these boys could generate anti-gravity fields, they could create screwy fields of other sorts. It also occurred to me to wonder if these boys came from Earth. The pilot had looked human enough, but these accomplishments didn't. Not by my standards for human achievement in the age of the deaders. At any rate, I had to admit to myself that my pet term, cultural queer, did not describe to my own satisfaction members of a culture which could create things like this cabin. Not that I liked making the admission. It's hard to admit an exception to a pet gripe against things. The excitement of getting down and opening the Christmas packages saved me from speculating too much along these or any other lines. I hit a minor jackpot right away. In the same bag were a compass, a catalytic pocket lighter, a knife with a sawtooth back edge that made my affection for Mother waver, a dust mask, what looked like a compact water filtration unit, and several other items, adding up to a deluxe Deathlands survival kit. There were some goggles in the kit I didn't savvy until I put them on and surveyed the landscape out the viewport. A nearby dust drift I knew to be hot glowed green as death in the lightly smoky lenses. Wow, these specs had Geiger counters beat a mile, and I privately bet myself they worked at night. I stuck them in my pocket quick. We found bunches of tiny electronic parts. At least I think they were spools, maybe of magnetic tape, but nothing to play it on. Reels of very narrow film, with frames much too small to see anything at all unmagnified. About 3,000 cigarettes and unlabeled transparent packs of 20. We lit up quick, using my new lighter. A picture book that didn't make much sense because the views might have been of tissue sections or star fields. We couldn't decide, and there were no captions to help. A thin book with rice paper pages covered with Chinese characters, that was a puzzler. A thick book with nothing but columns of figures, all zeros and ones and nothing else, some tiny chisels, and a mouth organ. Pop, who'd make a point of just helping in the hunt... Sorry, let me reread that. That doesn't seem to make sense. Oh, yes it does. Pop, who'd make a point of just helping in the hunt, appropriated that last item. I might have known he would, I told myself. Now we could expect turkey in the straw at odd moments. Alice found a whole bag of what were women's things, judging from the frilliness of the garments included. She set aside some squeeze packs and little gadgets and elastic items right away, but she didn't take any of the clothes. I did catch her measuring some kind of transparent chemise against herself when she thought we weren't looking. It was for a girl, maybe 6 sizes bigger. And we found food. Cans of food that was heated up inside by the time you got the top rolled off, though the outside would still be cool to the touch. Cans of boneless steak, boneless chops, cream soup, peas, carrots, and fried potatoes. They weren't labeled at all, but you could generally guess the contents from the shape of the can. Eggs that heated when you touched them and were soft-boiled evenly and barely firm by the time you had the shell broke. And small plastic bottles of strong coffee that heated up hospitably too. In this case, the tops did a 5-second hesitation in the middle of your unscrewing them. At that point, as you can imagine, we let the rest of the packages go and had ourselves a feast. The food ate even better than it smelled. It was really hard for me not to gorge. Then, as I was slurping down my second bottle of coffee, I happened to look out the viewport and see the pilot's body and the darkening puddle around it, and the coffee began to taste, well, not bad, but sickening. I don't think it was a guilty conscience. Deathlanders outgrow those, if they ever have them to start with. Loners don't keep consciences. It takes culture to give you those and to make them work. Artistic inappropriateness is the closest I can come to describing what bothered me. Whatever it was, it made me feel lousy for a minute. About the same time, Alice did an odd thing with the last of her coffee. She slopped it on a rag and used it to wash her face. I guess she'd caught a reflection of herself with the blood smears. She didn't eat anymore after that either. Pop kept on chomping away, a slow feeder, and appreciative. To be doing something, I started to inspect the instrument panel, and right away I was all excited again. The 2 screens were what got me. They showed shadowy maps, one of North America, the other of the world. The first one was a whole lot like the map I'd been imagining earlier. Faint colors marked the small, civilized areas, including one in eastern Canada and another in upper Michigan that must be countries I didn't know about. And the Deathlands were real dark, just as I'd always maintained they should be. South of Lake Michigan was a brightly luminous green point that must be where we were, I decided. And for some reason, the colored areas representing Los Alamos and the Atlantic Highlands were glowing brighter than the others. They had an active luminosity. Los Alamos was blue, Atla High violet. Los Alamos was shown having more territory than I expected. Savannah Fortress, for that matter, was a whole lot bigger than I'd have made it, pushing out pseudopods west and northeast along the coast, though its red didn't have the extra glow. But its growth pattern reeked of imperialism. The world screen showed dim color patches too, but for the moment I was more interested in the other. The button armies marched right up to the lower edge of the screens, and right away I got the crazy hunch that they were connected with spots on the map. Push the button for a certain spot, and the plane would go there. Why, one button even seemed to have a faint violet nimbus around it, or else my eyes were going bad, as if to say, push me and we go to Atlantic Highlands. A crazy notion, as I say, and no sensible way to handle a plane's navigation according to any standards I could imagine. But then, as I've also said, this plane didn't seem to be designed according to any standards, but rather in line with one man's ideas, including his whims. At any rate, that was my hunch about the buttons and the screens. It tantalized, rather than helped, for the only button that seemed to be marked in any way was the one, guessing by color, for Atlantic Highlands, and I certainly didn't want to go there. Like Alamos, Atlahai has the reputation for being a mysteriously dangerous place. Not openly mean and death-on-deathlanders like Walla Walla or Porter, but buggers who swing too close to Atlahai have a way of never turning up again. You never expect to see again 2 out of 3 buggers who pass in the night, but for 3 out of 3 to keep disappearing is against statistics. Alice was beside me now, scanning things over too, and from the way she frowned and whatnot, I gathered she had caught my hunch and also shared my puzzlement. Now was the time, all right, when we needed an instruction manual, and not one in Chinese either. Pop swallowed a mouthful and said, "Yep, now'd be a good time to have him back for a minute, to explain things a bit. Oh, don't take offense, Ray. I know how it was for you, and for you too, Alice. I know the both of you had to murder him. It wasn't a matter of free choice. It's the way us Deathlanders are built. Just the same, it'd be nice to have a way of killing them and keeping them on hand at the same time. I remember feeling that way after murdering the Alamoser I told you about. You see, I come down with the very fever I'd faked and almost died of it, while the man who could have cured me easy wouldn't do nothing but perfume the landscape with the help of a gang of anaerobic bacteria. Stubborn, single-minded cuss." The first part of that oration started up my sickness again and irked me not a little. Damn it, what right had Pop to talk about how all us Deathlanders had to kill, which was true enough, and by itself would have made me cotton to him if he'd claimed earlier he'd been able to quit killing. Pop was an old hypocrite, I told myself. He'd helped murder the pilot, he'd admitted as much, and Alice and me'd be better off if we bedded the both of them down together. But then the second part of what Pop said so made me want to feel pleasantly sorry for myself and laugh at the same time that I forgave the old geezer. Practically everything Pop said had that reassuring touch of insanity about it. So it was Alice who said, "Shut up, Pop," and rather casually at that, and she and me went on to speculate and then to argue about which buttons we ought to push, if any, and in what order. Why not just start anywhere and keep pushing them one after another? You're going to have to eventually. Might as well start now, was Pop's light-hearted contribution to the discussion. Gotta take some chances in this life. He was sitting in the back seat and still nibbling away like a white-topped, mangy old squirrel. Of course, Alice and me knew more than that. We kept making guesses as to how the buttons worked and then backing up our guesses with hot language. It was a little like two savages trying to decide how to play chess by looking at the pieces. And then the old Escape to Paradise theme took hold of us again, and we studied the colored blobs on the world screen, trying to decide which would have the fanciest accommodations for blasé ex-murderers. On the North American screen, too, there was an intriguing pink patch in southern Mexico that seemed to take in Old Mexico City, and Acapulco, too. "Quit talking and start pushing," Pop prodded us. "This way you're getting nowhere fast. I can't handle hesitation. It riles my nerves." Alice thought you ought to push 10 buttons at once using both hands, and she was working out patterns for me to try. But I was off on a kick about how we should darken the plane to see if any of the other buttons glowed beside the one with the Atlahai violet. "Oh, look here! You killed a big man to get this plane!" Pop broke in, coming up behind me. "Are you going to use it for discussion groups, or are you going to fly it?" "Quiet," I told him. I'd got a new hunch and was using the dark glasses to scan the instrument panel. They didn't show anything. "Damn it, I can't stand this anymore," Pop said, and reached a hand and arm between us and brought it down on about 50 buttons, I'd judge. The other buttons just went down and up, while the Atlahai button went down and stayed down. The violet blob of Atlahai on the screen got even brighter in the next few moments. The door closed with a tiny thud. We took off. That's the end of Chapter 3, and I think probably a good place for us to stop. I like like this story so far. It's it doesn't, amble around. It gets right to the point. If you are enjoying this at all, I highly recommend taking a look at Fritz Leiber's other books. If you enjoy sword and sorcery, he is one of the greats. He wrote Faferd and the Grey Mauser, who inspired many others after them. And this pair of adventures are one of the archetypical sword and sorcery, foundations almost. Faferd is one of the big inspirations when it comes to the idea of a barbarian, but also a skald. He's sort of a mix between a bard and a barbarian. And the Grey Mauser is your arcane trickster rogue, masterful in legerdemain and with a quick tongue. If you're into that kind of thing at all, they're a must-read. I can't recommend them enough. Thanks for hanging out today. If you did, I appreciate it. If you're listening on later in YouTube, then thanks for that too. We are listening this time around to Aindulmedir Star Lore. I figured we'd give the Lunar Lexicon a bit of a break. You can find it on Spotify, Bandcamp, YouTube. Give it a look. Aindulmedir is a really cool dude and makes great tunes. And as always, thanks for hanging out. If you got any questions or comments, you shoot me an email. It's the same as my YouTube channel name at gmail.com. And yeah, that's it. I'm going to read again on Tuesday after work, sometime between 5:15 and 5:30. And I will catch you folks then. Take it easy and enjoy the rest of the weekend.